why is it that programming language designers use the word for? And it's not just like C++. There's kids languages too. Pencil code uses the word for. That's a block language. It doesn't really matter. Like lots of language designers made decisions about how they represent their code. I wonder, what is the data? Like, when C++ was made, like what kind of evidence did they use to make their decisions? Or like, Python's much newer. What is the evidence on various decisions that they made in Python? Like what's the evidence on the white space? What about the colons? All the other funny things. And so I like kind of naively thought, well, let's just go look it up and gather all the data that the language designers have been gathering and try to figure out like what was the right answer so that maybe we can make it a little easier for these kids. What I wasn't expecting was that there wasn't any data. And that language designers have, in fact, emphatically been against gathering data, and I'm not kidding about that, for a long time. And this intuition that like this sort of like it's not part of their community gathering evidence is really weird sounding. So people that like aren't used to this idea that scientific communities also have their flaws and imperfections, this has actually been formalized by a number of scholars. One of them is there's a guy named Antti Juhani Kajana, who's this Finnish scholar, and he actually analyzed effectively every paper from like 1950 till 2012. This is like peer-reviewed, top conferences, made decisions about National Science Foundation support, all sorts of stuff. And it turns out between that entire 60-year time period, there was 22 experiments.
Wow.
And that is nuts. Absolutely nuts. Like that just should not be true. When people are designing programming languages, there's two parts. There's the technical, you got to make sure that it works, and then people have to use the damn thing. That's a fact. We all do it, and developers get paid an enormous amount of money nationwide or worldwide to use these things. Hundreds of billions of dollars a year gets paid to devs. So tiny little impacts in productivity impact billions of dollars nationally. It's a big deal.
And is that including even just like quasi-experimental or?
Yeah, so whenever you talk about gathering data, how you gather it depends a lot on the context under which you're gathering. So for example, the word you use, quasi-experimental, often means that you lack certain methodological controls in an experiment, but sometimes you have no choice. You actually have to do that. For example, I can't give half of the country cancer, right? That doesn't make sense.
I don't think it'd pass IRB either.
Yeah, I think the ethics board might have an issue with it, like just plausibly, right? Just on a practical level in education, this is a big deal too, because even though it's much less extreme, I can't take kids and randomly assign them to schools that are at various levels of poverty. I can't randomly assign them to new parents or stuff like that. So there's always an element of, in the field, you have to make certain compromises when you're conducting studies, and there's no choice about that. Even if you really wanted to, it would be impossible to do otherwise. On the other hand, it's full experiments, and there's surveys and stuff like that too. Full experiments where you do have custom controls, those have value too. You just use them for different kinds of things when you're looking for evidence. So we kind of do a combination of things, and that's really common.
Yeah, and in education, for people who don't have a background in research, it's particularly difficult to do full experimental studies. One, it tends to make things decontextualized, like you might be going to a lab setting rather than a social setting where kids are learning. But the quasi side of things, you have a lot of factors and variables that you can't control for because you're in a live setting where kids are learning, not just in the environment that you are testing in.
Yeah, so I think that the model that I like the most, and you may not like this particular model, I don't know. There's a very famous scholar named Austin Bradford Hill. You ever heard of this guy?
Mm-mm.
You know the phrase that smoking causes cancer? You know this?
Yeah.
I mean, it's commonly known. Not everybody buys it, I guess, but the evidence is very clear, right? That's Austin Bradford Hill. He was basically the first scholar to sort of show pretty definitive evidence that smoking not is correlated with cancer, not might be related to cancer, but no, it causes cancer, right? And the way that worked was called medical randomized controlled trial. Now, when people say that word, randomized controlled trial, they think it's a custom experiment that just had very careful controls and all sorts of stuff like that. But actually, since Bradford Hill, experiments, even in other disciplines where you have these constraints, just like you do in computer science education, they use a combination of what can we control and what can't we, and then how do we correlate with other factors. So I'll give you an example. In some of the original studies, they would do things like, okay, I know that I can't give people the cancer, and I know I can't control their smoking habits, so I can't control for that, but I can control for certain other kinds of things. And so they would basically design these studies where they had control groups, and they did it for certain things that they cared about that they can manipulate. And then there was other things that they basically just tracked anything related to it so that they could correlate it in and rule out alternative explanations. So when we conduct studies, although nothing's perfect, you have to just kind of do the best you can. We always try to follow the Bradford Hill model, where it's like control what we can control and then correlate in any other factor that we can so we can at least get clues about causality.
Yeah, and then I'm assuming doing follow-up studies to kind of like re-verify in different scenarios and with different participants and whatnot.
Follow-up studies, replications, you want other groups to do it in a different way. You want people to vary the experiments. Science is complicated and you want all that stuff.
This excerpt was from episode 27 of the CSK8 podcast, and it was titled Accessible CS Education Through Evidence-Based Programming Languages with Andreas Stefik. You can listen to this full interview as well as hundreds more by searching for the CSK8 podcast on your favorite podcast app or by simply going to jaredoleary.com.